I even had a little post-it that's just gotten lost saying record. Good. So, most important piece of legislation ever passed, the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And probably, I erred in not assigning four of you to do the heavy lifting of explaining this to the rest of us. So now I realize I have to do it. So it's kind of a challenge, since those of you who have already done this have set a very high bar for how to interpret a primary source. Okay. So most countries and most states had an established church. For example, in Massachusetts, you are required by law not only to pay taxes to support the congregational church in your town, but also to attend the congregational meeting house. There had been some leeway given in Boston in the 1680s when a Church of England was opened up. And by the time of the Revolution, in fact, there are 3 churches of England in Boston. Other towns don't have a Church of England. The ministers for the Church of England often are paid by the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, but the Congregational Church is supported by taxes. And the Congregational Church, every town in Massachusetts, a town could not be formed unless it was a congregation. As Massachusetts, as you know, and we don't need to get into the whole history of Massachusetts here, was formed by Congregationalists. And each town had to have a meeting house. They didn't call the building the church was the congregation. And as you're probably aware, if you have passed by the State House, in front of the State House, there's a statue of Mary Dyer. Anyone know anything more about Mary Dyer? Okay, Matthew's nodding his head. Why is her statue in front of the State House? Matt? Lindsay, Javon. Okay, well, actually, we're lining up now to talk about Mary Dyer, much the way folks in 1660 lined up to watch her be hanged on the Common. Yes, Matt.
Well, I think I've answered this before in another class, so I'll give someone else the opportunity.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Lindsay.
Can you hear me? Hello? Okay. You kind of answered most of it, but I was going to say that she was a Quaker, and she was hung for, I believe, practicing and preaching.
No, actually, for being a Quaker.
Okay.
And it was the inner voice. I'm not going to get into Quakerism right now, but this is in the 1600s. So Massachusetts, yeah, we could talk all day about the old Puritans and executing Quakers. Virginia also had an established church, and it was the Church of England. And each community was a parish, and a lot of the folks we've been talking about, or we'll talk about, were on the vestry. They built the churches, they oversaw it, and the church plays a very important role in preserving public morals, and often the minister is often a teacher. And so a close connection here in Virginia. Other states are similar. In New York, there's a diversity of religions, but there's the Dutch Reformed, and there are Dutch Calvinists, and there are Anglicans, and there are Puritans, and there are Quakers, and there are Jews. New York, something of an anomaly, although religion very important. Rhode Island is even more anomalous, because there anyone can believe whatever they want, and Massachusetts regards that as just a step short of hell, if it isn't actually a step beyond hell, where anyone can believe anything they want. And Virginia, we'll stick with Virginia for a moment or two, has an Anglican church that is established. And here's an interesting story that happens early in 1772 or so, just as James Madison is coming home from Princeton, where he had gone off to college. And in Orange County, Virginia, there is a Baptist minister who is holding a service out in the woods, actually in an open field, because the Baptists don't have a meeting house. In fact, they're not allowed to have a meeting house. And the Baptists pose a certain threat to the Virginia establishment. The deans told me I can't ask you about your religious affiliations and then find out who is a Baptist here and can explain what being a Baptist is. So I have to explain what the Baptists are all about and what the Quakers are all about, as if no one knows any of these things. Does anyone know what? We can go back to the Quakers if you'd like. Anyone know anything more about the Quakers and why in Boston they're hanging Quakers in the 1660s? Okay, so the Quakers don't call themselves Quakers. And this is a religious movement that begins in the 1600s. And the idea is that the inner voice speaks to each of us. And we often can't hear it because the world is so noisy. So what we need to do is shut out the world, and we will be able to hear that inner voice. And so a Quaker meeting is very much like this group. If I stopped talking, that is, there would be quiet. You don't say anything until the spirit moves you. And if you've been to a Quaker meeting, sometimes the spirit moves someone to say something really, well, who are we to judge? But, the Quaker meeting is different from a congregational meeting where you have a learned person lecturing to you, which I know is the mode you prefer since twice a week you show up to listen to me. But in a Quaker meeting, each of us would sit silently until the inner voice, or we could say if this were if history were a religion, until the inner voice of history spoke to one of us. And I can picture, Trevor or Matt or Giovanni or Lindsay, suddenly we would welcome their voice, but my voice would probably be the one you'd want to tune out. Okay, so Quaker meeting, inner voice speaks to us. And this is something that poses a threat to, of course, to the congregational clergy, because if everyone has the inner voice that'll speak to them, if we shut up, then what point is there for us? So that's the Quakers. The Baptists are somewhat different. Yes, Paul.
I thought you were going to ask if anybody knew anything about the Baptists.
Oh, good. Do you know anything about the Baptists?
Yeah, so I know that the Baptists believe that your baptism as a child isn't really your baptism, and you can't go off of that. So you have to be baptized as an adult, and it has to be your choice to be initiated into the church.
Yes, exactly. That's why they're called Baptists, because they think infant baptism, what sense does that make? The infant doesn't know anything. You have to be baptized as an adult. And typically, this is why Baptist churches, by the way, often were built beside a body of water. So the Charles Street Meeting House on Charles Street was built on the shore of the Back Bay so that the Baptists could be immersed in the waters of the Back Bay. And this is, again, it's a biblical thing. It does have roots in this, well, the roots in the same Bible. John the Baptist was the reason he's called the Baptist. But the Baptists believe in adult baptism as opposed to infant baptism, but also, like the Quakers, have this idea that each of us individually is seeking salvation, and each of us has to have his or her own relationship with God. And God doesn't see the differences that we might perceive among ourselves. There is neither rich nor poor, Jew nor Greek, slave nor free in this idea. That and actually that's the Apostle Paul who said that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, free nor slave. And the Baptists have a similar idea. Now, the Anglican Church in Virginia in particular, and even here in Boston, if you go into any, there are two of the old Anglican churches remaining, Old North and King's Chapel. And has anyone been in either of them? Two historic, yes, V has. Anything you want to share with us about either of these great edifices, V?
Well, it's been quite a while since I've been to the Old North Church. I noticed that when I did go in, it seemed more closed off, where because of the way the boxes of the pews and
Yeah.
things are set up, and to me, it appeared that the more elite people were able to go into the Old North Church as opposed to everybody else that lived in the town. That's how I kind of saw it.
Well, I think you're definitely on the right track. Though the church was paid for by people who bought those boxes. So you owned your box, and the boxes closest to the pulpit are the more expensive ones. If you couldn't afford a box, you might sit up in the balcony. And some of these churches, Old South, which was a congregational church, but had a very similar plan, had a second balcony for servants. Okay, but yeah, you own a box and you pay a fee for it every year. It's kind of like, Matt's box at Fenway Park. It's really a nice one, a luxury one. And some of us are sitting out in the bleachers, right? But he deserves to have a better box and be closer to the action than those of us sitting out in the bleachers. And those folks sitting on the floor under the pulpit, they're closer to God, actually, because that's where they are. And you would dress up to go to church. In fact, it was a spectacle of putting on your Sunday best. Some religious traditions have the idea of dressing up and others have the idea of not dressing up. And I'll get to what the Baptists believe in a minute, because in a Virginia church, as in a church in Massachusetts, you have the boxes that are owned by the wealthier folks, and that's their box. And if you go to Old North, there are names of the people on them. And in fact, at the very front, they have the box that belonged to the Barbadian merchants. These are the merchants who do business in Barbados. And this is like it's their corporate box. So anyone doing business in Barbados can use their luxury box. It's right under the pulpit. And those of us sitting up in the balcony are watching the better sort of people down there mingling. And we know they are closer to God. I mean, that's really where the one advantage of having a box here in New England is you can actually put in a heater, a little box with stones in it to keep your feet warm. You don't have that up in the balcony. Very drafty up in the balcony. And it's harder to hear up in the balcony and other things, which would make you want to be able to get down into one of those boxes on the floor. You can also put in cushions and things in the box. And in Virginia, going to the Sunday meeting was a ritual where you are, a church service is a ritual anyway, but you're also seeing the better sort of people who are really dressed up in the kinds of clothes that some of us can't imagine ever owning. And one of the central rituals in the Episcopal service or the Anglican service, similar to that in other Christian denominations, is receiving communion, where you line up and you wait your turn and then you go kneel at the altar rail. And of course, those who are in the boxes have gotten there first, and those of us up in the balcony have to wait a long time coming down the stairs, going up the aisle. But this is a very important ritual. Now, by law, you are required to do this, even if you've become a Baptist. And the Baptists, as I said, have this idea about neither free nor slave, Jew nor Greek. And they say God doesn't recognize these distinctions among us, rich or poor, free or slave, Jew or Greek. For God, each soul is equal. And the Baptists preach, and in the 1740s, there's a big religious revival that goes all across the country, and the Baptists are part of this evangelical movement. And, the Baptists say, why are we having these social distinctions that are of this world in the Sunday worship? Because this purpose of this, do you think God really cares what you're wearing or how much money you have? This is what the Baptists are asking. I'm not asking you this. Well, this would be a pretty good quiz question. Does God really care about, what grade you got on the quiz? Or what, kind of car you drive, or these other things. Of course, in Virginia, no one was driving a car in the 1700s. And the Baptists see all of this and the fact that they have to attend this worship service as really idolatrous and getting away from the purpose of religion, which is to get you closer to God. But by law, you are required to go to the Anglican service in Virginia. So the Baptists are required to go, and they have to wait their turn. And seeing the people who are better dressed going first, and then you have to walk past all of the better dressed people to go up and wait your turn at the communion rail. And do you know what the Baptists do to show how much they don't like this whole tradition that the Anglicans have, forcing you to go to the meeting and showing off before other people, men and women? You know, God thinks all of this is nonsense. So the Baptists will go up to the communion rail, and then they will take off their clothes, and they will stand naked in the eyes of God, as well as in the eyes of the astonished Episcopalians. So this is something the Baptists do, which, as you can probably understand, really annoys the Anglicans. If any of you know, well, I don't know, no, the deans told me not to talk about the Anglicans anymore. Anyway, this is really quite shocking. Then the Baptists also, as I said, don't see the social distinctions that are very important in Virginia. You don't have to go to a college in order to become a Baptist minister. What you need to do is have the Spirit of God and be able, of course, to read the Bible and preach the word. And thus there will be Baptist congregations that are both black, they're both black and white people in these congregations. And there might be a black minister for a congregation of blacks and whites. It's really a radical challenge to the status quo. There's a Baptist in South Carolina named Andrew Bryan who gets this idea that everyone should be free. And of course, this is an idea that really captivates those who are enslaved by him. He sets them free. And you can see why something like this is going to be a challenge to the status quo, this idea that all souls are equal in the eyes of God. And you can see where this is leading. It's one of the reasons why in Virginia, there's a crackdown on the Baptists, because they do pose a series of threats to this established order. Anyway, the story I was about to tell you wasn't of the Baptists throwing off their clothes, which is something that happened with some frequency at the Anglican services, but instead it's when young James Madison comes home to Orange County from his going to college up at Princeton, and he hears about a Baptist minister who is leading his congregation out in a field, and suddenly there appears on the scene the local Episcopal minister or Anglican minister. And just as the Baptist minister is about to lead the congregation in a song, the Episcopal minister attacks him with a horsewhip and actually jams the butt of the horsewhip into the Baptist minister's mouth, so he will not be able to sing. The Anglicans really don't like singing in church, although they do have songs, but so I don't know if this was a commentary on not liking the singing or just not liking the Baptists. The sheriff also arrives on the scene as this Anglican minister is bullwhipping the Baptist minister, and the sheriff promptly arrests one of the ministers. Which minister does he arrest? Yes, Paul.
I'm assuming the Baptist one.
Yeah. Why would you assume the Baptist?
Just basic religious prejudice.
Yeah. So yeah, the Baptist is the one creating a nuisance out here, forcing this poor Anglican minister to bullwhip him to prevent him from singing his hymns. And so James Madison thinks this is all really puzzling because, well, why does the state, in this case, the sheriff, take a role in determining which is the religion that should be practiced here? Madison's come to have a different idea about the role of the state. And it doesn't go away, by the way. The Baptists do not go away. just to fast forward just a few years to the year 1774, I don't know, and I apologize if I've already told you this story about the First Continental Congress, when Massachusetts sends its representatives to Congress. Samuel Adams, John Hancock, Robert Treat Paine, Elbridge Gerry, and another guy from Massachusetts shows up, the Reverend Isaac Backus. Have I told you about the Reverend Backus? Who's a Baptist minister from Middleborough. And Backus wants to know, how come Massachusetts, the assembly, the group that sent these delegates, makes the Baptists pay taxes to support the Congregational Church? What do you think of that question? Doesn't this guy have some kind of nerve showing up at the Continental Congress? These guys are trying to solve this big problem of Britain tyrannizing over poor Massachusetts. And here this Baptist shows up complaining about Massachusetts taxing the Baptists to support the Congregational Church. And no one really, other than the Baptists, questioned this in Massachusetts, the fact that everyone pays taxes to support the Congregational Church. However, in Pennsylvania, you're not paying taxes to support the Quakers or the Anglicans or the Presbyterians or any other denomination. And in Virginia, you're not paying taxes to support the Congregationalists. You're paying taxes to support the Episcopalians. And so you can see the Congregationalists from Massachusetts don't find they have a whole lot of support in Philadelphia. And they need support in Philadelphia because if the rest of the Congress thinks these guys are a bunch of religious fanatics, they'll say, Massachusetts has really done itself in this time. So the Congress tells the delegates first, the leaders of Congress call for a meeting of the Reverend Backus and these guys from Massachusetts. And these guys from Massachusetts aren't really happy to see the Reverend Backus showing up and crashing the party. And Backus says, this is the only time he has a chance to talk to the leaders of Massachusetts because they think the Baptists are a bunch of cranks. And he says, how come would you want to pay taxes to support King's Chapel in Boston? King's Chapel being an Anglican church. And they say, well, of course not, because we don't belong to King's Chapel. And Backus says, well, my congregation doesn't belong to the Congregational Church. So why should they pay taxes to support the Congregational Church? And Robert Treat Paine says, it's really not an issue of principle with you Baptists. You just don't want to have to pay taxes. And Backus says, well, that's exactly what the British ministry says about you. It's not a matter of principle. It's you don't want to pay taxes. And you're talking about taxation without representation. Isn't that what we have? Since the Baptists have to pay taxes to support a church to which they don't belong. And the Reverend Backus's solution to this would be, anyone have a guess what his solution might be? What would he advise Massachusetts to do? I don't know if I've made it clear what the issues are here. Yes, Jovan.
He'd probably advise them to either stop taxing the Baptists or return to England where you can tax without representation.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good suggestion. 1 second, I want to get something. That's a very good point. Another suggestion might be, well, how about if the Baptists can simply check off on their tax form what church they want their taxes to go to? And Backus says that wouldn't work at all, because why would the state have any role in determining what my conscience is? That is, my conscience is between me and God. And the state doesn't have a role in this. He wants a separation between the state and church. And how is the state now in the business of enforcing what people believe? Now, the Congress tells these guys from Massachusetts, you know, you really need to do something for the Baptists, not oppress them like this. And so when you go back, you really should do something. And they tell Bacchus, when you get back to Massachusetts, go see the assembly and try to straighten this out. And so Bacchus, when he does go back to Massachusetts, goes to the provincial Congress. Remember, the assembly had kind of gone out of business when the governor suspended it, but now the body is meeting as the provincial Congress. And so he goes to the provincial Congress and they say, no, 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 the Continental Congress told you to go see the assembly. We're not the assembly, we're the provincial Congress. We can't help you. And Massachusetts, one reason Massachusetts is able to tax the Baptists to support the Congregationalists, does anyone know why they're able to do this? Aside from the fact that it's a good idea to tax everyone to support the church because the church does really important and useful things. Yes, Jovan.
Is it in their charter?
Well, I'm a little skeptical. Well, they do come from a place where there is an established church. And so it could well be in the charter. I would have to check on that, but that would certainly give them the power to do it. And of course, each town was founded as a congregation, but here you do have people who aren't part of the congregation who have converted one way or another. I mean, one reason why, you know, Mary Dyer was actually from here and she converts to Quakerism. Bacchus was from here and he converts to being a Baptist. So you have this development, but what politically gives the Massachusetts legislature the power? Yes, Paul.
Is it the Massachusetts Congress or is Constitution, or is that not a thing at this point?
This hasn't. This is before the Constitution, so this is in 1775, 1776. So yeah, we don't have a Massachusetts. And by the way, the Massachusetts Constitution does say you have an obligation as well as a right to worship the supreme being. And it does say you can do it in whatever way you want, although you still would have to pay taxes in a town to support the congregational church. What gives an assembly the power to do anything? How does it decide to do something? V, you want to start off?
Well, wouldn't that then fall under having that board meeting and come to the head of the president of the board, Continental Congress, then probably still in force, because politically they need the taxes from everybody that's able to pay taxes in order to continue to maintain the churches and be able to, if they should ever have any territorial issues, that the men would be forced to continue to go to war if they can't pay the taxes, or they can, and support the town.
Well, I think we're getting a little far afield here. I don't know under what circumstances the church is going to go to war, but just thinking, I think it's a more simple question than you're making it. Maybe I made it too difficult, too complicated a question. Trevor, do you have a thought on this?
So you said what gives the assembly the power to take action?
Yeah.
Would it just be the people voting them into office, like the will of the people?
Yeah, that's who they're elected by. And there are a lot more Congregationalists than there are Baptists. And the Congregationalists have a majority, an overwhelming majority in Massachusetts. The Baptists are a very small minority. And so they are somewhat powerless in a system where And all members of the assembly are Congregationalists. And here the Reverend Backus can't get elected. He wouldn't run for office anyway, but a member of his congregation isn't going to get elected to the assembly from Middleborough. And even if he did, he would be one of 300, Congregationalists who are happy with things as they are. So the majority governs, and the Baptists are a minority. And they're also a minority in Virginia, which is why they're getting arrested in Virginia. And the Virginia Constitution of 1776 is more explicit than the Massachusetts one about the rights of conscience. That is, you have the right to worship in any way you want. So, you're not going to get horsewhipped by the Anglican minister maybe anymore, but you still have to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church, which becomes the Episcopal Church after independence, because we no longer have the king at the head of it. So you're not going to get horsewhipped by the Anglican minister, but you still have to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church in Virginia. And you have to pay taxes to support churches in New York and Connecticut. In Connecticut, actually, the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians make a deal that how about we tax everyone and we split it. If you're a Baptist in Connecticut, you're still really stuck, or if you're a Quaker. So this is kind of the great scheme of things here. Most states have an established church, and by an established church, I mean it's one supported by taxes, that the state plays a role in supporting this religion. And the Baptists are the ones leading the charge, saying the state should not have a role in doing this. The state should not interfere in matters of conscience. And as I said, Backus goes back to Massachusetts and can't get any action from the assembly there or the provincial Congress, because what reason would they have to change this? The Baptists are never going to outvote them. But Virginia is somewhat different. And this does get kind of to what V was saying before about needing the support of people. During the course of the war, the Baptists wonder, how come we are being called on to help fight the war and help pay for this war when we cannot worship as we want and we're taxed to support a church we don't belong to? And what kind of a state are we creating? And it's really in this way that after, in 1778, Thomas Jefferson is asked by the legislature, he's a member of the Virginia Assembly, to revise Virginia's legal code. And Jefferson is quite a meticulous lawyer and framer of laws. And his revisions of the legal code are really pretty striking. He does eliminate most of the capital offenses, and also has one bill that will create a system of public education. That one wasn't passed in 1779. And the other one is the Statute for Religious Freedom. And it might be worth our while to take a look at the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which I was looking at earlier. And let me see if I can find it and share it with you. Okay. So, well aware that the opinions and belief of men depend not on their own will, but follow involuntarily the evidence proposed to their minds, that whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free and manifested, the parts in italics were actually added by the legislature, and that all attempts to influence it by temporal punishments or burdens or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and are a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who, being Lord both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do, that the impious presumption of legislators and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, have assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking, as the only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them on others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time. What do you think of this? What's he saying here? I know we just got started and now I stopped to ask you what you think. What's the point of this so far? Well, that people are imperfect and we are fallible and uninspired men. And then we set up our own opinions as the only true and infallible. Okay, I guess we get that. Okay, that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves and abhors is sinful and tyrannical. That even the forcing him to support this or that teacher of his own religious persuasion is depriving him of the comfortable liberty of giving his contributions to the particular pastor whose morals he would make his pattern and whose powers he feels most persuasive to righteousness, and is withdrawing from the ministry those temporary rewards which, proceeding from an approbation of their personal conduct, are an additional incitement to earnest and unremitting labors for the instruction of mankind. This is an interesting point he is making here. Let me just see if I can underline this. Okay. Those temporary rewards proceeding from an approbation of personal conduct. That is, if a minister is getting a salary from the state, he doesn't have any reason for those earnest and unremitting labors. So that's a very important thing. And even forcing someone to support a teacher of his own religious persuasion is wrong. Okay, so compelling a man to pay to propagate opinions, which he just, so there are several different things that this law is attacking. It is sinful and tyrannical to force someone to pay to propagate opinions he doesn't believe. And even forcing him to pay for opinions he does share, it means he might have to support a pastor he doesn't really like. It's quite conceivable. There could be ministers like college professors, like baseball players, like race car drivers, like accountants. Some are better than others, okay? And saying we're going to have a general fund and all these ministers are going to get paid, that deprives us of the opportunity to choose which one we want to support, and also doesn't allow us to reward those who make these earnest, unremitting labors. Okay, I think either we get this or we don't. Okay, and here, where's the, okay, that our civil rights have no dependence on our religious opinions any more than our opinions in physics or geometry. Therefore, prescribing any citizen as unworthy public confidence by laying upon him an incapacity of being called to offices of trust and emolument unless he profess or renounce this or that religious opinion. So Virginia, like most states, had, you had to be a practicing Christian in order to hold office. So you have to then profess or renounce your religious opinions if you wanted to hold office in Virginia. And that's not, well, it's actually injurious to the advantages which everyone has a natural, to which everyone has a natural right. So this is one big thing here. Also, it tends to corrupt the principles of that very religion it is meant to encourage by bribing with a monopoly of worldly honors and emoluments those who will externally profess and conform to it, that though indeed these are criminal who do not withstand such temptation, yet neither are those innocent who lay the bait in their way. Okay, the opinions of men, let me see if I can underline this. The opinions of men are not the object of civil government, nor under its jurisdiction. And to suffer the civil magistrate to intrude his powers into the field of opinion, and to restrain the profession or propagation of principles on supposition of their ill tendency, is a dangerous fallacy, which at once destroys all religious liberty, because he, being of course judge of that tendency, will make his opinions the rule of judgment. By the way, what do you make of this so far? I should have stopped and let you get a word in edgewise. And by the way, what we are laboring through here is the preamble to the act itself. This is all the justification for the act, why we are passing this. In a moment, we'll get to the act itself, and maybe we should have just gotten to the act itself rather than stopping here to ask you what you think. Okay. So you'll have the tendency to make your opinions the rule of judgment and approve or condemn others only as they square with or differ from your own. That it is time enough for the rightful purpose of civil government for its officers to interfere when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. And finally, truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. That she, that is truth, is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. This is probably the most important sentence here, so we should go over it again. Time enough for the rightful purposes of civil government when principles break out into overt acts against peace and good order. So punishing someone for what he believes isn't really necessary, because you can punish someone for an overt act against peace and good order. But finally, truth is great and will prevail if left to herself. She is the proper and sufficient antagonist to error, and has nothing to fear from the conflict unless by human interposition, disarmed of her natural weapons, free argument and debate, errors ceasing to be dangerous when it is permitted freely to contradict them. So if you don't agree with someone's religious principles, or as he was already mentioned, principles in geometry or in physics, you might have different opinions on that, but you argue and you debate them. You don't make this the subject of law. Okay. Then we get to the actual act itself, which is, we, the General Assembly of Virginia, do enact that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinions in matters of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Okay, so that's the big piece of it here, that You won't be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, and nor be enforced or suffer an account of your opinions or belief, but everyone will be free to profess and to maintain your opinions in matters of religion, and that won't diminish. Yes, V.
The passage that you read, isn't that similar, or was it eventually made into the part of the Constitution where freedom of religion, freedom of all
Yes.
religion?
Yes.
That's what it all sounds like.
Okay. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because we have to remember this is before there is a constitution and before anyone knows there is going to be. So Virginia is passing this, and this really is the forerunner of that. And, Jefferson is the author of this. The legislature doesn't pass it in 1779. It's not going to be passed until 1785. And the real work of getting it passed is done by James Madison. Jefferson's off in France when the legislature finally passes this. And that's really a big story. But yeah, this is the fundamental idea behind what we know of as the First Amendment. That is, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are two kind of different clauses there about what Congress cannot do. This is, but again, remember the First Amendment, as it was written, dealt with the federal government. This is a state action here, but it is actually the underpinning to that idea of religious liberty. And one thing to bear in mind, aside from what this is saying and how it is setting it up, is that this is a unique thing in the world. A government saying the state doesn't have a role in promoting religion, that is interfering in the matters of conscience or coming down on one side or another. And then the next paragraph, it says, and though we well know that this assembly, elected by the people for the ordinary purposes of legislation only, have no power to restrain the acts of succeeding assemblies, constituted with powers equal to our own, and that therefore to declare this act irrevocable would be of no effect in law, yet we are free to declare and do declare that the rights hereby asserted are of the natural rights of mankind, and that if any act shall hereafter be passed to repeal the present or to narrow its operation, such act will be an infringement of natural right. So here they're saying, look, this assembly only has power to legislate now, that a subsequent assembly could revoke this. But they're trying to say that this particular liberty is a natural right, and that the assembly really doesn't have power to restrict it. So this is quite an extraordinary piece of legislation, the Statute for Religious Freedom, which, as I said, Virginia doesn't actually pass. Okay, any other thoughts on this, questions on this? In many ways, this is, well, it is, as I've already said, the most important piece of legislation ever passed, because it's not only establishing religious freedom, but the argument that the statute is making about why we are doing this, so that a magistrate doesn't have this authority, and that the state doesn't play a role in this. You can see it's extended to other areas, religion being the most important. But should the state come down on one side or another in someone's argument over physics or geometry or anything else, it's really quite a radical idea. Now, I mentioned that Jefferson wrote it in 1778. The legislature doesn't pass it. Jefferson winds up, serves a term as governor, not a very good term as governor. And then he is off in France when James Madison is elected to the legislature, and Madison manages to get this passed in 1785. And here, what's happened in Virginia is the Baptists recognize that they do have a certain degree of power in Virginia, even though they are a minority, because Virginia still requires their taxes, their support militarily, and the Baptists are going to withhold any of that unless Virginia stops taxing the Baptists. And in 1784, 85, as you know, Virginia has this problem of debt as everyone else does. And the Baptists say, we're not going to help out anymore. And Madison has a philosophical appreciation for religious liberty, and religious liberty is what the Baptists want. And there even are some Anglicans who think they agree with this, that it is corrupting of the Anglican Church to have the state rewarding them. You know, in England, they have a state church, and ministers are appointed by the prime minister. Bishops are appointed by the prime minister. And is that really in service to God, or is it in service to the prime minister? And would the same thing be happen in Virginia if priestly offices were subject to appointment by the governor? It's really a corruption of this. And the real power in the Virginia legislature is not held by James Madison. Madison is a brilliant's probably the wrong word. A French observer said that Madison is less brilliant than Mr. Hamilton, but more profound. Madison is a real thinker as opposed to someone who shines in debate. He usually spoke so softly, no one could hear him. Patrick Henry is the real power in the Virginia legislature. And for most of the time, Henry is the governor, or the governor in Virginia is elected by the legislature. And if you want to get reelected as governor, you have to get along with the legislature in Virginia. So Henry sees that there's this agitation over this, but also understands that if he comes down against the Anglicans, well, most people are Anglicans. What governors want to go against the majority of the people in Virginia? And so Henry proposes kind of a compromise measure that he thinks will satisfy everyone. How about if we let you check off on your taxes where you want your money to go to? The Anglican Church or the Baptist Church? Or you can even imagine throwing in Quakers or Jews or anyone else who could get money from the state. What do you think of that idea? Matt's saying, yeah, he kind of likes that idea. Why, Matt? You're nodding. By the way, Matt, did we again not let you talk about the voting thing?
No, we did that last week, so we
Oh, thank you. Good.
got that through.
Great. Thank you.
I like the option because I think one way or the other, they're going to try to enforce taxation, but at least giving you an option to at least represent or fund the religion that you partake in, at least is giving some level of autonomy to the individual.
Okay. Would anyone else support this, or anyone oppose this idea of, you get to choose where your money goes to? Yes, Trevor.
I feel like I wouldn't love the state, especially with religion being so intertwined at this point, to know which religion I am, like to have that tied to voting records and all that type of stuff.
So you would be a little leery of this because then the state knows you're giving yours to the Church of the Subgenius, or to the Rastafarians, or to the Reverend Moon, or I don't know. I'm just guessing, Trevor.
Yeah, all
there.
of those are right.
All of those, yes. V, you have a thought on this?
I'm kind of leery about it too, because even though that they would be collecting and supposedly separating taxes based on religion, but if it's going to the state, as a whole, who's to say that when all the money comes in that it's still not used for what the state originally intended for behind their backs, because it is what it is.
Yeah, okay, good point. There's some tax collector sitting there, and these aware of the fact that sometimes these tax collectors, by the way, can do dishonest things, and so who knows what they will do with this money once they have it. So what Trevor was putting in for the Church of the Subgenius winds up going to V's new pool or something. Who is going to audit this? And yeah, so who knows? You're giving the state this power, in addition to, as Trevor was saying, the state now knows what you think. And then, as this law says, you're even depriving someone, of supporting the particular minister they like. Now, of course, another argument in favor of having the well, society needs some moral underpinning. That's the idea. And the church provides that. So this is one way to make sure the church has the wherewithal to provide the moral underpinning, aside from the fact that the minister often is a teacher. And if everyone has to go to the meeting house, you do want people to be prepared and so on. So there are theological problems here as well as political problems here with this. So this is what's going on in Virginia. And you can see, Matt kind of liked Patrick Henry's idea of the checkoff. If that had gone through, who knows, it might have worked. On the other hand, religions change. This is, by the way, why in Massachusetts, to jump ahead a bit, there no longer is an established church, because in the first decades of the 19th century, that is the early 1800s, there's a change among the Congregationalists who adopt Unitarianism. And so this is why on a lot of these New England town greens, you'll see two kind of identical churches. One is typically, and they might each call themselves the First Church. One was the Congregational Church, and then sometime between 1800 and 1830, either the minister became a Unitarian or the congregation did. And then there's a faction within the church where they changed their minds. Instead of being Congregationalists, they become Unitarians. And then those who did not become Unitarians say, well, wait a minute, it's our church. And those who became Unitarians say, no, it's our church because there are more of us. And this really winds up in court in Massachusetts. And for the most part, one group got to keep the building, the other group got the silver, and then they could use the church silver to buy a lot and build a new church. So you have that split going on because people change their minds. Back in 1773 or 1776 or 1785, there were Congregationalists, Anglicans, Baptists, Quakers, Jews, a few Catholics. By 1900, by 2000, by 2021, there are lots of different religious practices or none at all. Anyway, Madison is able to squelch the checkoff idea that Henry had, and then is able to get the legislature to pass the statute that Jefferson had written in early 1786. And Jefferson is in Paris, and he is really elated when he gets the news that they've passed this law. In fact, Madison sends him a copy of it. And Jefferson immediately translates it into French and Italian, has it translated into German. He sends a copy of it to the Pope, wanting to show the Pope about religious freedom emerging in America. And also Jefferson notes that some of the state constitutions that talk about religious freedom as the freedom to worship anywhere in the Protestant denomination. That is, all Protestants have religious freedom. So we're not going to discriminate against Quakers or Congregationalists or Presbyterians but we will against Jews, Catholics, Muslims. And this, by the way, is an argument that comes up during the ratification debates about whether the, well, in Massachusetts, because the Constitution, and I'm jumping ahead, says that there will be no religious test to determine if someone can hold office. And that's an issue during the ratification debates. And here in Virginia, they're forbidding religious tests or the state playing any role in this. So you can see if we were frozen to the religious practices of 1785, it would be similar to the Church of England still being the established church, even though it's not a majority of English people. Or you see struggles over religion in various European societies, or people not having any religion at all. And Jefferson wrote kind of triumphantly about the Virginia Statute. Initially, it did talk about, well, it doesn't talk about, it does talk about the father of our holy religion, which is somewhat vague. If you are if I asked each of you who the father of your holy religion is, you all may have a different answer. But Jefferson says the fact that it doesn't talk about religious freedom for Christians or for Protestants indicates that the Assembly was trying to establish religious freedom for the Christian and the Protestant and the Papist, or Protestant and the Catholic, for the Jew and the Muslim, and for the infidel of every denomination. So opening this up to any religious practice by depriving the state from a role in interfering in matters of conscience. Okay, so this is what's happening in Virginia in terms of religious freedom. And you can see different gradations of this in the different state constitutions. In Connecticut, in order to hold office, you had to profess a belief in the Trinity. But you could be a Congregationalist or an Episcopalian, but you have to believe in the Trinity in order to hold office in Connecticut, or in some places to vote. You have to be a member of a certain church. This is one of the issues in Massachusetts. So this is the state of things as far as religious freedom goes. Any questions on all of this? Yes, Paul.
Yeah, so we've been focusing on like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia a lot. What
Yeah.
are the other states doing at this time? Are they like following the precedent set by these states, or are they doing their own thing?
They're pretty much doing their own thing. Each state has its own problems and its own issues. You saw actually at the time independence was being declared, the war is being fought, there had been this great deal of cooperation among the states. After the war is won, the states really have their own problems. And this is a very big issue. Virginia has the kind of leisure to do this because Virginia has open land to the west. Virginia is the biggest state, and Virginia is being able to solve its debt problem. Other states are having trouble. So one thing that's happening, I'm glad you asked the question, because the Virginia statute is kind of a big philosophical thing, but in most states you do see the kind of more mundane political issues going on. And the issue of debt. How are we going to pay this debt? Because each state owes a debt to the soldiers, and how can we pay it? And I was tempted then to just start talking about Massachusetts again because it's important. But each state has its own issues. Georgia, for example, the big issue is the fact that the Creek Indians control much of Georgia. Georgia, the white Georgians along the coast claim everything to the Mississippi River. Most of that territory is occupied by Native Americans. And also, Georgia is bound to the rice trade, can't really get into the interior because of the Indians. and also has now the Spanish on the frontier in Florida, and has this continuing problem with the Creeks. The South Carolina also is a trading relationship with the Cherokee in the interior. The Cherokee had sided with the British during the war, and South Carolina also is, it produces rice also is the big crop in South Carolina. And there had been a movement of people into the interior of South Carolina, although real power was on the coast. South Carolina has, the revolution had really been a civil war in South Carolina, tore apart the interior of the state. Now, as the population is growing in the interior, you do see a push there to get more power, because power is held in the Tidewater in South Carolina. North Carolina had been, before the revolution, the fastest growing state. In fact, the population quadrupled between 1750 and 1776, and most of the growth happened in the interior, mainly small farmers, and a lot of Germans and Scots-Irish who have come into the interior. Again, the coastal elite had power. In fact, in the 1760s, there had been practically a civil war in North Carolina over the interior versus the coast. Maryland, big issue in Maryland, no land to sell because Maryland is a landlocked state, and no real resources. Maryland produces tobacco. The tobacco market is kind of sunk. So what Maryland was doing was printing up money, printing paper money as a way to get over the debt problem, because Maryland also had to raise troops and had to pay them with something, but didn't have anything to pay them with. So Maryland printing up paper money. And of course, there is a faction in Maryland that understands if you keep printing paper money, the entire economy becomes worthless. And we need to think of something else. And there's actually kind of a dispute going on between Maryland and Virginia over trading rights on Chesapeake Bay. Each state sees trade on the Chesapeake as really vital to the state's survival, shipping tobacco out, buying stuff. Baltimore is beginning to emerge as a port, but there are a lot of other small ports along the eastern and western shore of the Chesapeake. And Maryland says, well, anyone who comes to trade in Maryland has to stop in Virginia and pay taxes there. They're not going to come to Maryland. So we would like to be able to tax goods coming into the Chesapeake, but then Virginia says, well, wait a minute, if someone coming into the Chesapeake has to stop in both Maryland and Virginia, no one's going to come to the Chesapeake. So you have this trade dispute going on between Maryland and Virginia. New Jersey, similar issues. And again, New Jersey is pulled in two directions, the Philadelphia orbit, the New York orbit. The other New England states, Rhode Island is printing up paper money. And Rhode Island also recognizes the big problem of debt and says, well, we can solve that. More people owe money than are owed money. So what Rhode Island does, say, for example, that back in 1780, you had loaned, we'll say James, $100 in gold. Okay. Now it's time for him to pay you back. James doesn't have $100 in gold, but supposing he wants to give you $100 of the paper currency that's worth about 1/10 of what $100 in gold is, would you take that? Or let's suppose James has $100 worth of wheat. James, do you have $100 worth of wheat or corn, something like that?
I would take that over the currency.
Okay, so yeah, we would take that over the currency. Paul, will you accept $100 worth of corn instead of $100 in gold?
I'll take my gold, please.
Okay, see, actually now everyone just heard what you said, which is good for James, because Rhode Island passes a law that if the debtor, in this case James, makes an offer to repay the debt and the creditor, that is you, turns it down, the debt's canceled. So that's really good news for James and really kind of bad news for you. But you can see Rhode Island does this because Rhode Island recognizes there are more people like James who owe money than people like you who are owed money. And, we don't have a whole lot of sympathy for you anyway. You, the 1%, or whatever you want to call those who have this capital now. So that's happening in Rhode Island. And so you see, each state is really responding to these crises in different ways. And Congress has no ability to do anything. And the other states aren't saying, gee, let's wait to see what Pennsylvania does or Virginia does or Massachusetts does, because we're competing with them. Maryland's not going to say, boy, those people in Virginia are really smart. No, we don't like those people in Virginia because they're trying to take advantage of us at every opportunity. And Massachusetts and Rhode Island really despise each other at this time, because if you're a merchant coming into Massachusetts, you have to pay taxes on things. Well, if you bring your stuff into Newport, you don't have to pay taxes on it. And then people who buy it there can bring it into Massachusetts and not having to pay taxes on it. And there are also stories about creditors like you running for the Massachusetts border as someone like James is chasing you with a wheelbarrow filled with stuff, trying to get you to turn it down so that then the debt's canceled. So this is really the state of things individually in each state. And I think what we're going to do next time, well, I'm trying to think how we can work in another of our discussions. Why don't we'll have a quiz next week, and then we'll go back to the discussions the following week, which I've really enjoyed. Next time, we'll talk more about some of these problems going on. Regrettably, I am going to have to talk about Massachusetts again. I'll talk about Shays' Rebellion and also James Madison's vices of the political system. Because in early 1787, as we're getting ready for as Madison is getting ready for the convention, he prepares a memorandum on the problems in the political system. What's wrong? We have these individual problems in each state, and the problem of currency, etc. But for Madison, it's a more fundamental problem with the way the system is structured. And his memorandum, Vices of the Political System, is an attempt to make sense of what the problems are, and also to come up with a solution for the problems of the 1780s. Okay, so that's on our agenda for next time. We'll talk about Shays' Rebellion, Vices of the Political System, and I will look forward to talking to you all then.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.